So what's up YouTube? In today's video, we're going to talk about should you learn SwiftUI or UIKit. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button below. Also hit the like button, it definitely helps out the channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this video. So to kick things off, if you're new to iOS development and you're kind of in between should you learn SwiftUI or UIKit, I'm the guy to give you the right answer because I've been an iOS engineer for over 8 years now. So in my personal honest opinion, I would suggest that you first learn UIKit first. By me saying that, that does not mean don't learn SwiftUI. You definitely need to learn SwiftUI as well. But I would suggest that you learn UIKit first, and I'm gonna give you some of the pros and cons of SwiftUI and why I recommend you learn UIKit first. So to kick things off, we're gonna start with the pros first, because I think that's the better way to kind of start this video. So the pros. One big benefit that you have with going with SwiftUI is the fact that you can get your development ramped up much quicker. By getting your development ramped up much quicker, you can able to go ahead and get started with some of your UI elements, get those things mapped out. It's much easier to go through the process of building out views in SwiftUI versus in UIKit. Things are very clunky. It takes you a long time to get things built out. Whereas in SwiftUI, you can actually see everything that you're building as you're building it out. You can either use the interface that's built out in Xcode to build out your views, or you can actually go ahead and just write out the code to build out your views, and it's much quicker versus in UIKit. Not gonna lie to you, pretty hard to try to build out your views till you get familiar with UIKit. Then it becomes a little bit easier, but even from there, the way you want to build out your views can be very difficult depending on your team. You can choose to use storyboards, you can do things programmatic, you can use nibs. You're gonna have some pros and cons if you choose any of those. So to me personally, I think UIKit is great, but SwiftUI, gotta say, it takes the cake when it comes down to actually building out views because it's so much easier. So one of the other things when it comes down to SwiftUI is just the fact that SwiftUI is so much easier to jump into. When it comes to SwiftUI, programming out your views, when it comes down to just wanting to learn Swift, it's a lot easier when you're actually going into SwiftUI versus UIKit. Hate to say it, you gotta understand how constraints work and other things like that. And if you're really new to iOS development, you know, it may be daunting to you and you probably wouldn't even want to learn iOS. But with SwiftUI, the tutorials are pretty easy to go through. It makes it very seamless. Most of the things you want to build out are pretty simple for the most part. Whereas UIKit, just to be honest with you, it gets really difficult. Especially if something as simple as wanting to have like 2 labels right next to each other and wanting to be able to have that label to say, for instance, some of that text to go, you know, across the screen or something like that. It could be very difficult to do something like simple as that. Or even just wanting to make like a carousel or something like that inside of a scroll view or inside of a collection view. You know, doing those type of things can be pretty difficult. I mean, unless you're more so experienced or seasoned and you kind of know how to work with something like that. But some of the simplest things can be very difficult in UIKit, whereas in SwiftUI, they've made it so much easier. So I personally think that if you want to jump into SwiftUI, you have a much easier time. It's so cool to build out some of the things that they've given us new iOS developers. But again, you gotta go with UIKit first. So now that I've given you some of the sweet things that you can do in SwiftUI, I gotta give you some of the cons in which why I say you kind of gotta wait a while before you can try to actually use SwiftUI. So one of the biggest things with SwiftUI to me personally is the fact that SwiftUI doesn't have a super concrete architecture. Now, I know some people are gonna say, well, you can use MVVM, which is totally fine, and that is the architecture that's currently being used right now in SwiftUI. But the other thing is, for iOS developers who are more seasoned, we know that MVVM is something we've pretty much migrated over to years ago. MVC was like the old way of building our apps, and if you're still using MVC, kind of want to say shame on you, you shouldn't be doing it anymore. Although Apple recommended MVC, as iOS engineers, we learned a long time ago, like MVC is not the way to go. Even MVVM, there's other things that we as iOS engineers have added on to MVVM that just works better with our paradigm, depending on how you want to build things out. For instance, projects I've worked on in the past and currently, we use MVVM, but also we have a coordinator. So the coordinator helps us with being able to present different views whenever we want to without being in a particular order. And I give a small example around that. So when it comes down to, say you're building out an application and you want to present the login screen anywhere inside the application, if you run with just the MVVM design pattern, especially if you're using storyboards or something like that, it's pretty difficult to be able to show that login screen anywhere inside the application where the user may be. Whereas with the coordinator pattern, you have a specific way you can have things designed and laid out so that you can present that screen anytime. The only thing we're recording there is the fact that you need to hand over some piece of information prior to the coordinator getting set up, whether that's, some user info or how you want the view to be presented or so forth. You can do your own research on coordinators, but that's just a small example, as in architectures that currently are being used in most applications nowadays. And one thing with SwiftUI is it doesn't play well with the coordinator pattern. So if you're using a different design pattern, you may have to kind of, work your way around how you're going to add in SwiftUI to your current architecture. For some apps, it just works seamlessly with no problem. Other apps, if you're using other design patterns such as Viper, MVVMC, or some of the other ones that I can't think of at the moment, you're gonna have a hard time trying to add in SwiftUI because it may not work as easily as you probably wanted to. The other big knock I gotta give on SwiftUI is just the fact that SwiftUI just doesn't have a lot of documentation, especially when it comes down to building out some of the views or some of the features that you probably want to add in your application. Something as simple as maps, like SwiftUI has maps, but there is some limitation on some of the functionality that you want to add in to your application just because you're using SwiftUI if you end up building something with maps. Whereas a UIKit, I hate to say it, but UIKit is just honestly, it has a ton of documentation. You can go online and find out pretty much how to build whatever you want using UIKit for the most part. Any issues have been resolved with using UIKit, and just to be flat out honest, UIKit is pretty much bulletproof. You can do whatever you want with UIKit. Even some of the custom things that Apple probably wouldn't recommend you do, you can easily do in UIKit. Whereas in SwiftUI, some of those methods or function calls you may want to use aren't actually available as of yet, and Apple is still currently working on SwiftUI. So it's going to take a while before it gets to that point where everyone's going to be using it. But as of right now, you can use SwiftUI, but just do know that there's not a lot of documentation around SwiftUI, so it may take you some time before you can actually go through and build out whatever you want. And one of the big last pieces I'll say that's a big con for trying to use SwiftUI at this current moment is the fact that not many companies are honestly using it. And one reason many companies aren't using SwiftUI is because, number one, it may not make sense depending on the project that you're currently working on or the project that the company has set up at the current moment. And if it doesn't make sense, then why would you switch over to SwiftUI? UIKit still works. Now, that doesn't mean that within the next 4 years from now, most companies aren't going to be moving over to SwiftUI, because trust me, they are. Most companies in the next 4 to 5 years, they're probably fully embedded in SwiftUI. But at this current moment in time, I don't see many companies migrating over to SwiftUI immediately, especially for the fact it's still being built. It's kind of the same thing when Swift first dropped. When Swift first came out, everybody loved Swift, but everybody wasn't able to fully migrate over to Swift. It took some people a couple of years before they were finally able to move over to Swift from Objective-C, just because Swift was still being built. There was a ton of changes going on, and if you moved over to Swift when it first dropped, I'm almost betting you had to rewrite a ton of code because Apple was changing things underneath the hood. So it's kind of best to wait a little while until things mature a little bit. Then once the language matures, or as in SwiftUI concerned, once SwiftUI has matured a little bit, then I think you'll be at a position where you can finally move over to it. Also, another thing is SwiftUI is only available from iOS 13 and up. So if you're on an application that's much older than iOS 13, then 9 times out of 10, you can't even use SwiftUI. Plus, on the other thing, there is a lot of bug fixes in iOS 15 from iOS 13. So it might make sense for you to wait a little while longer until the application you're working on is probably up to speed or has moved all the way up to iOS 15. If you're still on iOS 13 or later, you may want to wait a little while longer until everything's cleared out and you can actually go ahead and use iOS 15, which is, to me personally, the better version of SwiftUI. And that's the version I probably want to use in any application I work on. With that being said, I just want to thank you guys for watching the video. Again, make sure you go out. You do learn SwiftUI, but in my personal opinion, learn UIKit first. It's going to help you tremendously when you go back and you learn SwiftUI, because you'll have a deeper understanding as to what's going on, because UIKit came first. And after UIKit, when we ran into all these issues and bugs, and Facebook decided they wanted to make React Native because of all the issues that were going on in UIKit, Apple decided they wanted to make SwiftUI, which fixes all of that. So you don't even have to use React Native nor Flutter and none of that other stuff anymore. You can just fully immerse yourself into SwiftUI. But again, I would give it probably about another few years before you truly dive in it. But I think for any new application that's being built, SwiftUI is perfect to go ahead and get started with. But any older application, I probably will wait still like another year or two before I fully dive into SwiftUI. Unless you're building out very, very small views, then obviously you can build those into SwiftUI and see how they work with your current architecture, as well as how they work with the application that you're currently working on. That being said, I want to thank you guys again for watching the video. Make sure you hit the like button if you like the content I'm bringing you guys. And outside of that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel. See you.